Greetings, folks, and welcome to a Church Dismantled, the Kingdom Restored podcast extension. Live at 3:45 is really an extension of this podcast that's available on most podcast carriers. We've been running live at 3:45 for about 2 months, and it's usually Monday and Thursday. Today we have a special treat. We have a panel, a back-to-back panel, a group of pastors who are going to talk about their experience as part of the pandemic. How they've led their congregations as spiritual leaders, what they've learned, what they've experienced, how they've experienced God in the midst of this. Then in the second half hour at 4:15, we have four other leaders who will talk about what they're learning as we walk through this podcast together. Most of them, they all four have been engaged in the podcast and engaged with me in that. And so I'm looking forward to hearing how it's impacted them, reflections they have. And so these will be two 30-minute sessions. Our four guests, and we have four to start off this afternoon, and one of them is not here, or two of them actually. Audrey Carnegie is not here yet, and Hyacinth Stevens. But Rodney Martin and Lynn Parks. Lynn is from Oxford Circle, and Rodney Martin is from Lidditz. He also serves as an overseer or bishop. And so I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves and the context of your congregation or your congregations, and how you experienced the last year as congregations and as leaders. So feel free to go ahead and do that. Lynn, why don't you start us off?
Okay, my name is Lynn Parks. I'm pastor at Oxford Circle Mennonite Church in Philadelphia. I've been here for 21 years now. I was associate pastor, and about a year and a half ago, shortly before the pandemic, I was installed as lead pastor. And so when the pandemic started, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know I was going to face this as lead pastor. And so, the last year, it's been a lot of challenges. It's been a lot of learning. We've tried a lot of different things, trying to keep people connected. And I think one of the things that I've found that has been most important is it's so important to have other leaders in the church that you can depend on, people who can help you out, who you can run ideas by, people who have insight into areas that I don't have insight into. And so we've been able to continue and move into online services and continue to keep our ministries running because of a lot of other people in the church besides me who have a lot of talent and who keep things going. So it's been difficult, as it has been for all of us, but it's also been a growing time for us as a congregation.
Thanks, Lynn. In what you shared, I got a number of questions I'll come back to, but Rodney, why don't you go ahead now?
Yes, Rodney Martin. I started at Lidditz Mennonite as associate pastor in 2000, became senior pastor in 2009, and I think somewhere around three and a half years ago, also became bishop in the Conestoga River District of Lancaster Mennonite Conference. So I oversee approximately 13 congregations, along with Joe Miller. This past year was interesting. So in the middle of a pandemic, I went on sabbatical this past summer, so that was another interesting twist to it. But for us as a congregation, very steep learning curve at first, and just learning to use Zoom, do something totally different, created a lot of anxiety. But then I think a key word for me is simplicity. Church needs to be simpler, and that's been refreshing, as well as realizing the way we do church is not sustainable, and just being in a liminal space that's very tiring, but also creating an opportunity for rethinking how we're gathering as a community.
Rodney, thank you. I'll come back to you as well. Lynn, can you talk about Oxford Circle's urban context and how that was impacted by the pandemic, and your ministries as well? Because you have a lot of ministries there at the church that really are, your folks, you just don't show up on Sunday morning. So Zoom in terms of connecting. How did you adapt to the ministries that you have that have been so effective there in your congregation?
Yeah, several years ago, we formed a Christian Community Development Association, and that has grown quite a bit. And so we've offered GED and ELL classes for adults, after school programming, summer camp programming, a lot of different things. We had a thrift store that opened a couple years back. We have a family resource center in the local elementary school, and these are all ways that people in the church can volunteer and get involved in. We have several members in the church that are also employees of the Community Development Association. And of course, the pandemic, everything had to change. And we have a member of our church. He's one of our pastoral support team members who works for Young Life in Philadelphia and has a lot of connections around the city. And so he was able to bring together people to talk about, like, what are the needs that people are going to be facing here, because without school in session, kids are not getting meals. And so food insecurity was like one of the biggest concerns that we had, because a lot of families, or lower income families, they depend on school meals as part of their food source for the week. And so OCCDA, our Community Development Association, started a food giveaway fairly early on in the pandemic. Within a month, I think, of the shutdown, we started giving out food. And we first started with the families that we were already servicing. But that grew over the summer, and now we're giving away, we're serving, I've heard, between 100 and 200 families every week. It was higher than that, and we had 2 locations going, but then we brought it all down to 1 location, and that actually happened today. And there were days where I was coming here, and the line of cars would be through our parking lot and out down the street of people waiting to come and pick up food. So that continues to be a big need in this area. People lost their jobs. People had businesses that shut down. We had some people in the church that are small business owners, and their businesses shut down. But one of the things that we saw was just God miraculously providing, and generosity from the congregation, as we had some people who donated their entire stimulus check the first time around. And so we've been able to help several families and individuals pay bills during this time, as well as, providing food. And then in the fall, when we knew that school was not going to go back to in-person learning, our Family Resource Center staff came up with the idea of a learning pod here, and they managed to get that together. So all this year, we've had a learning pod going for, I think our maximum is like 10 or 12 students that we have space for. But then this spring, we were able to start another one for high school students. So that's been a real help for families. It's families who work here, as well as we looked for families whose kids did not do well with home learning, so that they needed the structure for, being around other kids and being with an adult who could give them one-on-one interaction and so forth. So we tried to make it targeted towards the people who needed it the most, because we knew we could only help a few people. So those are a couple of things that we've been able to do that has kind of helped meet the needs in the neighborhood. Because it really has hit the city hard, especially with schools being closed. Parents are not able to get back to work because they depend on school for childcare. They depend on, these other services in order to be able to get to work. And so that's been one of the challenges, is when the schools open, then people can go back to work.
So the schools are still closed, Lynn?
They are open for some in-person learning of the younger ages, but it switches back and forth. and you never know which school is going to be shut down. Like there's a school not far from where I live that opened up for like a week and then had to shut down because, somebody tested positive for COVID in the school. So,
So, Lynn, what was the strain on you as a leader, as spiritual leader, in terms of negotiating or managing these different new ministries and being aware of the needs? What did it look like at Oxford Circle for this to unfold in terms of leadership?
well, for myself, like this is all run through the CCDA, so I didn't have to. I'm a board member, so I'm giving some input and guidance, but I actually could serve as a volunteer in the food giveaway. So that helped a lot because then I was able to interact with the people a little more. But within the church, there hasn't been a lot of need. There's been some, but it's been more the anxiety around the pandemic. As far as pastoral care, it's remaining connected with people. I've found that just going back to the basics of pastoral care, where you call people, where you text people, where you send them a card in the mail or whatever, those are important ways of taking care of people right now. Just texting somebody and saying, hey, I'm thinking about you today, or, calling somebody and offering to pray for them. One of the things my husband and I did early in the pandemic is we went on a prayer drive, and we drove around to several houses near the church and prayed for people, took a picture of their house, and then we posted it on Facebook and said, hey, if your house is here, we prayed for your house today.
Wow.
So people really appreciated that.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat. As you look at the future, are you still remote in your worship services?
We're meeting on Zoom. We started out on Facebook Live, and that was too complicated. And then we went to a video, and we have a young man in our congregation who was editing video for us every week, putting it together, putting it on Facebook. And then finally we switched to Zoom, as well as we broadcast our Zoom on Facebook as well. And so we're staying like that until the end of May, and then we'll go to in-person services outside on our front lawn.
And as you look at the changes that have taken place at Oxford Circle, what of these do you think will stick, will remain part of who Oxford Circle is moving forward?
I think having more of an online presence is going to stick. We have some people who join us from other parts of the country. One lady in Puerto Rico joins us every week. She started early in the pandemic connecting with us, and now considers us to be her church. And so I think, we'll continue that online presence, which we didn't have before. But also I think, it gives us some opportunities to do some things. One of the hard things is getting people together. But doing things on Zoom, you can get to people, there's no excuse, you can come in your pajamas, you can come, you can be eating dinner, whatever you need to be doing. Your kids can be asleep and you can, come to a meeting or whatever. So I think we're going to continue to use that technology, but I think another thing is people really appreciate coming together. We had in-person worship for Easter on our front yard, and it was just incredible to be together, and people were so happy to see each other, and it's a witness to our community as well. When we're out there, we did it last summer, we did in-person worship outside, and the ice cream truck would go by while we were having our worship service, and the guy started cutting his music off as he got close to our building because he knew we were having service. We would all wave at him and he would wave back and he would continue on. So we appreciate having that interaction with the community right around us, which we can't have if we're inside in the building.
And one more question before I turn to Rodney. How is the city doing? How are the city churches doing? Were there new ways churches work together? What happened? What did you see looking in on your urban context?
there are churches who have faced like some difficult situations with not having funds to be able to continue to meet in their building or whatever. But we've been able to connect with a church near us, a Baptist church near us, and that has been special. We did some prayer walking during the pandemic with them. We've gotten together a few times to pray with them, and so we're looking forward to continuing that. A lot of the churches, though, have continued on from, some of the churches that I'm connected with through Kingdom Builders Network. They've continued and continued to offer services and do all of the things that they do one way or another, finding a way to continue on in ministry.
Thank you, Lynn. Rodney, turning to you, you used the word sustainability and liminality. Were you suggesting that where the church, that what you were seeing in the midst of the pandemic was that the way church does church, or the way we do church, isn't sustainable outside of the pandemic, or was that referencing within the pandemic there was this lack of sustainability? And say more about the liminal space, because you're overseeing 13 congregations, so you have a perspective that is different than any of us have in terms of how congregations have managed this, how they're doing. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think for my congregation in Lidditz, coming back from sabbatical, it was very obvious people felt worn out. And trying to keep something happening that takes a lot of resourcing and effort, putting together worship service on Sunday, just everything that's involved in a traditional church, and feeling people feeling worn out from the pandemic. But I really felt it was just basically taking a Band-Aid. The pandemic was taking a Band-Aid off of what was reality for us before the pandemic. It just exacerbated those challenges that were already there. So that's where, for me, the question of sustainability came up. As far as across the district, I think some churches are in the same place. I think some churches are asking different questions. Other churches, I think, see things as more of how do we just get back to fully functioning again. The liminality for me is the pandemic has thrust us all into a space in which we're in the unknown, right? What we're used to has been taken away. The way we function has been turned inside out. And so I've seen it as, rather than just trying to survive, it's an opportunity to examine, why do we do the things the way we do? What is the purpose for our existence? And what do we need to change in order to step into the new that God is raising up in our midst? And so I know those questions create a lot of fatigue, because pastors are already fatigued. And I was told by one of the members from my church that everything else is changing. Church is the last thing they want to change. It's just something to hold on to. And yet the person that said that also is acknowledging church needs to change. So it wasn't that they were throwing up a roadblock. They're just like, this is how we feel. And so that liminality, I think, is an opportunity, but it's one that, it does come with a price, and it's hard.
Rodney, as you look at not only your congregations, but others that you are aware of, what have been factors in how they've moved through the pandemic? What was in place or not in place that was helpful to them in moving through this liminal space?
Some churches already were Zooming or were streaming their services, and so I think it felt like for those churches the learning curve was a lot less. They had techie people who could set up things for streaming on Facebook or Zoom or however that was done. Other congregations, and so they just basically made a shift. I think for other congregations, there was experimentation that was done. One church in the city tried to set up the congregation in neighborhoods where people lived in neighborhoods. They would gather in a park in that neighborhood and try to use it as an opportunity to invite neighbors to come to the park and do church. But the challenge with that is when they were able to go back to the church building, that's what people wanted, and so that experiment kind of collapsed because it wasn't necessarily a paradigm shift for those people. And yet I still feel that is something that church may explore further down the road, as they begin to work at the cultural changes, the adaptive changes that are happening for them. So, but I think for a lot of people, as we went through this, there was as far as tending to the soul, tending to pastoral care, how do you overcome the isolation that we felt? Even getting on Zoom, it's not the same as being in person. And so how do we engage with community? How do you create community, sustain community when we're isolated? But also then, as you think about being on Zoom, how does that foster or inspire an imagination for thinking of community in a different way? Does Sunday morning have to be the central place for community? Can we be a diffused community or even a network as a church instead of trying to bring everybody together on a Sunday morning? Can we see ourselves as sent into the neighborhoods where we are? And how does technology enable us to do that in a more creative way?
So as you've asked those questions, how have folks responded, Rodney?
Well, I think I'm still very much at the beginning of asking those questions. As these things are talked about, I think we've just scratched the surface. And you have to be and you have to be gentle, I think, with where your church is at too. That because people are feeling tired and stressed and anxious, and so when you start talking about dispersing the church, that can add to that anxiety. But like I said, this is a liminal space, and so I think there is, if you manage it in the tension, there is an opportunity to imagine something different. So, but it's reframing things. So, the future will tell.
So I'm going to ask you, and then also Lynn. You mentioned that there were things that that were covered up with a Band-Aid that the pandemic took off that exacerbated what was already there. I'm not asking you to I'm not putting you in a spot about Lidditz or a particular congregation, because I think many of us who are in ministry would say that was true. What were those kinds of things that had been revealed in a pandemic that maybe were covered up with a Band-Aid before? And I would ask Lynn, did you have the same experience, or was it a different experience for you in Oxford Circle?
I think what I see is in a traditional church, we put a lot of emphasis on the gathering of the church. And that takes a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of finances, to put together a worship service. Whether you're a large church with a lot of finances or a small church, either way, there's a lot of energy that is invested. Before the pandemic, I was making the statement, we're so busy doing church, we don't have time to be church, because we're so busy trying to keep Sunday morning happening, keep the building maintained, keep our positions filled on the board or whatever teams we have, so that we can keep doing this stuff. And in this pandemic, people are too tired to do that. And so roles that before the pandemic, it might have been hard to fill positions. Now it's even twice as hard. And so that's for me is where they need to just think simpler. What don't we need to do? Now, a simple way of looking at that is for our Sunday morning. I had I had caused out of things that I like in worship, to create a complicated worship service. And so coming back from sabbatical, we cut a lot of things out. What used to be an hour and a half worship is an hour, or sometimes even less. And so that has, at least for me, has been very freeing, just to think, we just gather, we sing some songs, listen to a message, reflect a little bit, and that is church. Why do we need anything else? Church doesn't need to be complicated in order to worship God or be together as a community. It really is very simple, and the need to get back to that. I'm not sure if that was answering your
No, it
question.
is. That is. I'll turn to Lynn. Lynn, what about Oxford Circle?
We had to simplify our worship service as well, but one of the things, we find the coming together to be very life-giving. And what we've been able to take advantage of with being on Zoom is the breakout groups. And so after our sermon, we send everybody into breakout groups, and there's a couple questions for them to discuss. One we always ask, like, how was your week? Like, what joys and challenges did you face this past week? And then a question reflecting on the sermon. And people have really enjoyed that, because they say, I'm getting to know people that I haven't gotten to know yet in our congregation, because I would never have the opportunity to talk with them if we were gathering together in a worship service in the building. But because I've been put in a breakout group with them, I'm getting to know, like, I got to know them a little better. I got to hear a little bit about them. So that type of connecting has been really good. Another thing that we feel like has really gone up a notch during the pandemic is our youth ministry and the involvement of our youth. We have given them, our youth and junior youth, pretty much the responsibility of doing our children's story every week. And it's become the highlight of our whole service, because they're so creative. They're creating movies, and they're doing puppet shows, and they're doing cartoons, and like all kinds of stuff. And they love it. And we all love watching them do it. So they've really stepped up above and beyond and shown us, what youth are capable of doing. They've also been meeting together in huddles, where they're really doing deeper discipleship in small groups. So that's something that we want to see expand among our congregation. And so through these breakout groups, people are getting a taste for that. And so one of my dreams as we move out of the pandemic is that we will increase our small group ministry.
Well, thank you both. Encouraging to hear how both of you have worked at this. I'm going to ask you one final question. How have you cared for your souls during this time?
Well, for me, one of the things that I've started doing is spending time in silence with God. And that has been very life-giving, just like practicing a daily office and like taking a couple of times throughout the day and just sitting in silence with God.
Thank you, Lynn.
For me, so coming back from sabbatical, I didn't want to lose the refreshment that I had gained from being with the Lord in a very powerful way over 4 months over the summer. So once a month I try and take a retreat day. I'm trying to be very intentional about that, and then I go mountain biking just to burn some calories.
Terrific. Well, thank you both. I'm sorry we missed Audrey Carnegie and also Hyacinth Stevens. We'll catch them in the future, but I really appreciate both of you being here with us. And this question about self-care is one that Eldon Fry, who's the spiritual director, will be with us on April 29 at 3:45. And then he'll also be doing the leadership assembly for Lancaster Conference on the 30th. But we're going to make that virtual. It's an in-person event, but we're also going to make that 30th virtual, which is going to be open to anyone outside of Lancaster Conference also who would like to hear Eldon. And so we'll share that information later. So thank you both, and I really appreciate your sharing with us and your transparency and vulnerability and blessings in your ministry. And we're going to make a transition now to talking with some pastors who have been following the podcast I've been doing, A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored, that began on May 25. And I was watching the trial today with my students for George Floyd and realized it was the very same day in which he was murdered so brutally. And so it was May 25, I began the podcast, and it has taken on beyond what I would have anticipated. And Wes and Miller Penner from the very beginning were very supportive and encouraging. Wes and Millie, I don't know if I hadn't heard from you if I would have continued or not, but I knew you were listening and you were giving me feedback and asking questions, and you were so encouraging to me, and I really appreciate that. And Dave Martino, you did the same a little more recently, and Tom Philpot, you have been from almost the get-go as well, just really supportive. And so your encouragement, the four of you, has been really important to me. So I'd just like to begin, Wes and Millie, with you, and just talk about what are the themes, perhaps, of the podcast that have resonated or have been helpful, or that you've had critiques of or questions of. I'm not looking for affirmation here. I'm just trying to hear again what resonated with you as you listened, and how maybe have you applied what you've been hearing. But thanks for being with us. And why don't you introduce yourselves also and where you're at?
Yeah, we're Millie and Wes Penner, or sometimes people get it mixed up and call us Mess and Willie. We're co-pastors at Millersville Mennonite. We've been there. Millie's been there. You could talk to if you want. We started co-pastoring in 2012, June 2012.
So we're just outside of Lancaster City in Millersville. So we're kind of a congregation caught between the suburban and the rural in some ways, and the urban too.
Millie grew up there.
Yeah, this is my home church. So.
Yeah. Both half-time. My other half-time job is software development.
Yeah, we're also lay leaders who were called to be pastors. So
Okay.
That's part of our story. Is
Yeah.
not having envisioned ever becoming pastors, but here we are,
Yeah.
pastoring.
Terrific.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
When
you.
we came back from sabbatical.
The week that the shutdown started, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
our first
from
Sunday.
about, yeah.
Our first Sunday back was the first online service.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so in some ways it felt for us like reality was suspended from our sabbatical, which is our first, through to until we were finally able to meet in person again.
Yeah. So the podcast was bringing up a lot of spiritual realities that suddenly moved a lot further to the forefront. I think that for many people, the events of the pandemic were very much in a political earth kind of space, but there is something big happening in the spiritual realm, and I felt that a church dismantled was talking a lot about that. I think personally for myself, LMC had in 2014 or 2015, they had Jeremiah 29 as the dwelling in the Word. I was still kind of growing into the pastoral at Millersville. I think it was during that time that I felt the more, I don't know who chooses the scripture for dwelling in the Word for LMC, but that dwelling really stuck with me as the Israelites were caused to, like they were exiled from their home, from their spiritual home, from worship in the temple, and sent into a foreign land, but not just any foreign land. It was the land of their ancient ancestors, and a land full of other gods. And in many ways, at that time, I thought, oh, well, the church is going on an exile culturally. And we're going back to the culture of our ancient ancestors, to the ancient early church, I thought. And so with the events of this past year seemed to mirror that experience even more. And I thought that the themes and messages coming out of the church dismantled were talking about those things that I had been feeling for a long time.
Yeah, I think I would just add that the timing somehow of you suddenly kind of out of nowhere, it seemed to me, beginning to put together a bunch of different thoughts about the church and where we were and where we needed to go, just really struck me as a prophetic message, I guess I would say, for lack of a better way to put it, that these times right now are crucial. They're crucial for the church. especially, and really, I think it enabled us in some ways to look beyond the pandemic and to look, like Wes was saying, to look at more spiritual realities about, you know, what God has in mind for the church, where we've been and where we've been stuck, I'd say. So something about the timing was really helpful for me. And I would also say, just as we kind of came back around to the podcast again and again, just that it functioned like a compass for me. Something that helped me to identify true north again, because it's really easy to get distracted by side stuff in the middle of chaos kind of breaking out and people being all freaked out, for lack of a better way to put it. So.
Yeah, the landscape has really been messed up, the cultural, social landscape. And I think the two of you, and what I was hearing from you was within your own congregational context, you were wrestling with what does it look like to be church at the very same time? And what is God calling you to perhaps do in the midst of, again, as Rodney said, this liminal space? I mean, you were really wrestling seriously with that. And so it was not just the kind of personal connection, but it was how it had to do with your ministry and what you sense God doing there in your congregation. Thomas and David, welcome. Say something about yourselves, who you are, where you're at, one of you, and then the other. And were there themes or questions that connected with you on the podcast, and what difference has it made as you've been engaged in ministry?
Well, if you're not going to pick one of us, I'll go first.
Thanks, David.
Thomas is smiling. He's happy. It's been nice to just in general, just to kind of meet different people. There are a lot of faces here I've never met before. Conrad, I know you from quite a while back, and just been great to make a reacquaintance. I think just in terms of this podcast, one of the word that comes to mind to me is a convergence, and so many things. And and it's already been spoken about. I think convergence of different themes. First of all, of your own life. It seems to me your own life had a lot to do with this. Your diagnosis, something stirred in you, something was moved. I don't want to say something broke in a bad way, but I think there was maybe something broke open. That's what I hear from you, anyways. I appreciated you sharing that. Appreciated you sharing from your own experience, your own struggle with OCD, your struggle with your having gone through a difficult time in your marriage and going through a difficult time in your church as well, in your leadership. I'm not personally acquainted with that, but you brought that in. I can't imagine some of this stuff happening apart from your own experience, because it seems to really play into it and add a dimension to it. It was interesting that, maybe coincidental, that somewhere serendipitous, that some of this has happened right as COVID broke out. It seems to me that's another convergence piece here. And it gave you an opportunity and gave us an opportunity to talk more about what's happening in our churches and what's the long-term implications. I think it's helped me to see that some of these changes have been happening quickly, or not quickly, but over time. But what really happened quickly was the election. And I think there was a big shift depending on your church context. I think there was a kind of a breath, either a gasp in or exhaling over the last election. And our churches, we have in a small church now in Aurora, Ohio, which is somewhere right in between Akron and Cleveland. So we're rather suburban, but you don't have to go too far to get a little bit out in the country. So this is a different experience for me. I've been here for 3.5 years. I've been coming up on 4. I was 23 years in a church in Central PA. And what was really different for me, we had our district pastors meeting, and I shared that one of the things that really has affected me during COVID particularly during COVID, is just kind of loneliness. This is my personal story. I came from a church that had a significant staff of people. I could walk out and talk to people all day, and I like to talk to people. I don't have that here. I walk out of my church office and I hear crickets most of the time. So that's been difficult. And then being isolated from people even more has made it more of a struggle for me in that respect. Some of the questions, please interrupt me, Conrad. I respond better to questions rather than free association, but some of the questions I have that I wonder about this. I wonder how pastors of younger churches younger churches meaning church plants or churches where congregations are, young adults. I wonder how they're experiencing this transition in our culture. Do they feel it? I've been in ministry for 40 years. I see what life was like 20 years ago, 40 years ago. I see how different it is. Do young people, do the people that you teach at E-Town, do they understand the things that we're getting? Do they have a historical perspective of what's changed? Do they understand what kind of struggle this is? Because you're 18 years old. You've seen COVID. You can't meet with your friends anymore in school, but they've already been born into a more secular culture.
One of the interesting things, I talked with them before COVID about morale and their morale. And one of the things they would say is, we often say to each other, "How are you doing?" And they would say, "I'm dead." That was their language. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that was part of pop culture for an 18-year-old, but just to say, "I'm dead." And we talked about that, and this was prior to COVID. And they said, "Look, we're pessimistic about everything. We're pessimistic about the political polarization." That was before this year. We're pessimistic about global warming. We're pessimistic about, they just went down the list of things that they feel like they have lived the last 18 years through the market crash in 2007 and 8, which impacted many of their families at that point in time. And so I think it's a generation that, I'm of course leaving the church. And I think as a church, we haven't provided answers for them that are relevant to where they're at. And I think that's part of the deep grief I carry these days, that gets expressed in the podcast periodically, is I just feel grief. I feel grief because I've got students who I am more free to talk with Jesus about than I've ever been, who actually receive it, who give me space to talk about it. And yet, when I hear the church talk about these young people and some of the struggles and challenges and identities that they have, I don't hear much empathy. And I don't know. I've got a lot of questions, David, about how as a church we are ever hoping to relate to. I wrote about it in a podcast this morning, but someone posted on Facebook yesterday a picture of a zebra leaving its herd and a lion chasing it.
Yeah.
And the tagline was, "This is what happens to Christians who try to be alone." And I just thought about all the 20-somethings I know who have left the church. And what's the message we're sending them? That we're hoping they get mauled to death by the lion, that the only safe place for them is in this church. And for some of them, that's the least safe place. And so I think there is this huge gap between the church's understanding of this generation and I don't know what to do about it. I feel like I'm in that space, but I feel more comfortable, as I've said in the podcast often, in this cultural space right here than I do in the church's cultural space right now.
Thank you. One other thing I would say, I would appreciate that you have shared some resources. You mentioned a couple podcasts ago, Canoeing the Mountains by Bolsinger, and that was really helpful. To read that, and added a good perspective about what leadership looks like. Two metaphors, and I'll end with this. Two metaphors have been really helpful to me in sort of a reorientation, and it's already been mentioned, I think. One is this idea of the church being in exile, that actually is where we belong.
Yeah, amen.
That's been very refreshing, because conservative Christianity has not seen ourselves in exile. We've seen ourselves as fighting to maintain a position.
That's right.
As long as it's there, we don't have a mission. Our mission is to preserve and to change the culture. But if we're thinking of ourselves in exile, I also I read Walter Brueggemann's book, 1997, about churches, about the idea of exile. And I underlined things in it back then, and I'm saying, oh my goodness, more than 20 years later, how relevant is this? This guy was almost prophetic.
Yes.
This move to a counter identity. the need for having hope and despair and resisting assimilation. And that's the Old Testament context. The New Testament context, which has really come alive for me, is Sermon on the Mount and what in the Beatitudes. And this is what a church looks like in exile. And so having the cultural background that we have right now to preach this now has been really refreshing for me, because I can contrast this very vividly and say, we are now in exile, and this is what people in exile think, this is how we live, and here's how it's different than what we were used to, what we thought should be. So those two, that exile in the Old Testament and Sermon on the Mount in the New, has been really good. And I think this podcast has helped me to kind of articulate some of those things. So
David, thank you. That's powerful. I mean, you preached a sermon there. And I think one of the things I appreciate about my students is they don't have the kind of biblical literacy and baggage that when they hear me talk about Jesus, they're not hearing it through some of the baggage that, because they just don't have it. You know, they're biblically illiterate, many of them, which gives us a fresh opportunity to talk about, I think, who Jesus is. So thank you. Thanks for your encouragement. It's meant a lot to me. Thomas, jump in here, friend. Where are you at? What do you do? And any thoughts about the podcast? You're on mute. There you go.
Okay, there we go. My my mic on the computer here wasn't working, so it started yelling at me. Can you hear me now?
Yep, got it.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would say, you know, I'm a pastor of a small church. I'm actually an associate pastor at Village Chapel in, we call it New Holland. It's not in New Holland. It's not in Ephrata. It's not in Leola. It's in a cornfield. It's a rather small church, and yet we have 2 pastors and 1 elder. We all sort of take turns at things, and so very bivocational. I have a 40-hour-a-week job in Lidditz. It's a bit of a weird job for somebody in a Mennonite context. I work in the rock and roll industry, but that sort of fits how weird I am. I grew up in the church that I'm pastoring. That's maybe a little different from a lot of contexts people are used to. It seemed odd to me. I knew I had a calling in my life, but to be called into a church where, you know, my family was a little bit odd. They came here from New Jersey in the 70s, and so we were kind of that family. Like we didn't quite understand all the rules, and so to be now one of the pastors there, it's pretty interesting. But all that to say, anyway, when I first heard the podcast, I think it was in June, early June, it came at a really good time for me, because being in the entertainment business, you know, everything shut down. You know, when your business is putting 40,000 people in a space, you're not allowed to do that. So, you know, it was do a lot of work around the house, things like that. You know, I'm on furlough, and we don't know when things are going to open up again. And it could be a year or 2 years, you know, at the time we didn't know. And so, you know, as you run out of projects at home, and my son and I were both at home and, you know, trying to do school, and my wife actually was able to keep working. She's the one who would have loved to just be at home. She's very much the introvert, and I am very much the extrovert. And so being at home, you know, with my 7-year-old, it's great, but after a while, you really do long for adult conversation. And right about beginning the middle of June, I was not in a good place. You know, I need to be interacting with people. And along comes this podcast, that was far more interesting than anything else on Facebook. Talking about things that I actually care about, and so it was uplifting for me. It carried me through the month of June till July, when I heard, okay, I'm going to get back to work, but it's going to be different. Or, it's still different. We still have people on furlough, but it sort of came through for me at a time when I most needed some outlet for conversation. And and of course the topic speaks to my heart, because as a, well, I hesitate to say as a young man.
You can say it.
Previous in life, when I was younger, I was very politically motivated, and looking at the way society has changed in my lifetime, I like to say in my short lifetime, things have changed more than in the previous 3 or 4 generations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's difficult to watch. It's difficult to experience. It's what most of the church is going through. But I'd say maybe 15 years ago, came to a realization that all this political push and shove isn't fixing anything, and it can't. We had a joint service with Groffdale Mennonite Church one night, and we had his name is escaping me now. He was the former moderator at LMC.
Irvin Stutzman.
Pardon?
Irvin Stutzman?
Yes, Irvin Stutzman. He was talking about, we have this bus, we're all on the road, and everybody on the right side of the bus wants one of their people to drive the bus. And so they drive and they get over into the right-hand ditch. And then everybody on the left side of the bus says, well, we ought to get somebody from our side to drive the bus. They get their driver on. We go on the other side of the road. We're in the ditch on the left-hand side. And you have some folks who say, hey, we ought to be in the middle. So we get another driver and they drive down the middle. And then we even have others that say, hey, Jesus ought to be driving the bus. Well, if you follow that line, if Jesus is driving the bus, it's the church is running the state. And what really cut me to the soul was when Irvin said, if you're in any one of those groups riding along in the bus, you're on the wrong bus. Mm. And that really hit me. I thought, he's so right, because the church, it doesn't matter who runs the government. The government isn't going to save souls. You're never going to pass a law that's going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. Jesus makes the difference, and there's only one way people are going to hear about him, and that's from us. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I started seeing, it's like, wow, folks running around with picket signs and yelling about whatever party they don't like are not helping the witness of Christ. And I started backing away from politics as I went through STEP. Shout out to Lynn Parks. We spent 1 year down in Oxford Circle. It was great. Sitting through a church history class with Britton Rutherford and listening to what it was like when the first Anabaptists were rebaptized, mm-hmm. and what that really meant socially, mm-hmm. and how they were such social outcasts because they were casting off this notion of being part of society because they were baptized as a child. Like, they got their name then. You became a citizen. And to cast that off for the love of Christ and wanting to be something more, I started to realize that you know, probably the worst thing that could have ever happened to the church was Constantine. So many look at Constantine and say, this was the great moment when the church grew. And I had to start looking at it and say, no, this is the moment when the church took a really bad hit.
Yeah.
Became part of the state and started wielding the sword of the state. And then looking around me, I couldn't help but think, here we have Christians on every side of the political spectrum trying to get all their buddies together and vote for the person that they need to run the government or the people. And it's like, if I go get somebody to make laws on my behalf, those laws are enforced with force. So I'm forcing my will onto somebody else. How does that doesn't look anything like Jesus. And so I don't know if you can hear the themes from the Church Dismantled as,
Yes.
you know, it's very much part of my heart. So hearing your podcast, some of them have been really challenging for me, and I need that. We need to challenge one another. We can't just go with the assumed narrative. We have to think. We have to ask questions. If we don't, we're just rolling the ball down the street, not knowing why.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, I heard very clearly some of those themes echoing through what you said. And thank you, David, and thank you, Millie and Wes also. You all four have been important to me in this journey. There are folks who like what I'm doing and folks who don't appreciate so much what I'm doing. But I try to stay faithful to what I sense God's saying, and getting your feedback has been really helpful along the way. So thank you. Thank you for joining me today. I think we have a minute or two if anyone in the audience has any questions for them, for me, for any of us.
Conrad, may I ask you a question? I've
Yeah.
already spoken.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you'll speak, if you feel like this is, if there's any parallels here to a Reformation or a counter-Reformation, or whether those, you know, are those themes, are there any similar themes happening here among us right now?
Yeah, I think there are, and certainly I wouldn't be nearly the first person to say that. I mean, there have been, I think, missional authors, writers, scholars, mission leaders talking about that for the last couple of decades, you know, that there really is, the Reformation was a protest. It was a protest against the taken for granted reality that was not faithful to what Christ had called. And so I think, you know, probably the greatest criticism I face is this idea that I want to tear down the church. But when I look at what Luther did, you know, that protest was a tearing down of the taken for granted reality of the socially constructed church. And I loved when I interviewed David Downing, the C.S. Lewis scholar and my former colleague, he just talked about Lewis's disillusionment with, you know, he went to church on Sunday, but he was usually bored. For him, the church was deeper. It was the deep church. It was the universal church. It was the eternal church that we're part of. And so I can't begin to dismantle that, David. You know, that's not on my radar. First of all, I couldn't do that. And so if any one of us can effectively dismantle the church, it's a pretty weak church. What I want to be part of is this excavation project of Isaiah 40 that has captured my imagination since I was a kid. And I just discovered today it was Judson Cornwall. He wrote a ton of little books, but Judson Cornwall in 1978 wrote this little book about Isaiah 40, and it captured me. Just this idea that we get to be part of walking with this Holy Spirit in raising valleys, lowering mountains, making rough places plain and crooked places straight. And I only learned recently that was also Martin Luther King Jr.'s passage. I mean, that's what drove him to say, you know, let justice roll. And so I think this is the kingdom work, and some of it is tearing down and some of it is building up. I was pushed by several people a few weeks ago, when are you ever going to stop talking about this? And I went back to Isaiah, and, God says, Isaiah, don't stop until the stumps are left, but there still be life there. I'm not saying I'm Isaiah, but I'm just saying the church keeps giving us reason to challenge what we take for granted, to be church. And so I don't know. That's my reflection.
This has always been a curious question of mine. Like, I don't know, you're in sociology. Is collecting stats a big thing for sociologists?
Yeah.
So one thing that I was wondering, curious about was like, how many churches and how many different places were closed for how long? Because that was something that really struck me early on in the pandemic. Like, oftentimes people were talking about churches closing as a political type of thing. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty strong politics to affect so many churches in so many countries, especially in countries that actually favor the church. But so as a stat, that was always one thing I wondered.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do keep wondering, and I did an episode early on about this, what the long-term implications of this are going to be for people coming back to church and re-engaging in what we've called church. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean specifically church buildings, like not like the churches didn't close, but buildings were.
Church buildings, Yeah, and I often wonder too, what happened to the mission of the church during this time? Did we lose the mission? If we did, we must not have we probably didn't have a very good handle on it to begin with. Are we further ahead or further behind in the mission of God? I don't know the answer to those questions. You're a small group, and I'll just end with this. I'm really excited. I found an editor who is I've taken 50 or so of the episodes and I put them together in a book called Church Dismantled, and I found an editor who is he edited the sermons of George Buttrick. George Buttrick was East Madison Street, New York City pastor. Who, if you know Frederick Buechner is my favorite author of all time, a Presbyterian minister. He was the pastor under whom Frederick Buechner as an adult came to Christ. And so now my editor is working on this book with me, and I'm just so thrilled. He's 77 years old. His name is Charles Davidson. He's from Asheville, North Carolina. And he's doing a phenomenal job of keeping my voice intact, but really improving the prose. And so I'm just excited. I've got some readers, and some of you are doing that. And if you want to read it, let me know. But I think he is excited about what he's hearing. And so I think it has been a work that God has been part of, and you've been part of that with me. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, friends. We'll be back at 3:45 with John Sharp, sharing about the loss of his son, who was a peacemaker, a UN peacemaker, on Monday, about two and a half years ago, and should be a good session. Thank you, God's blessing, and thanks for all of you for participating. Peace to you all.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.